It's going to be like your first time. It's going to be nervous and tentative, and gradually we'll get closer to an intellectual climax, but it may take some time.
Maybe, yeah. Okay. So it's a good bit of banter at the start. I don't know if that's going to go in or not. But anyway, hello everyone and welcome to my podcast. And today I have Daniel Jupp, also known as Bartholemew Chiaroscuro. That's how he's famous on Facebook, really. And he's a fantastic commentator and an author of a book, A Gift for Treason, a Cultural Marxist assault on Western civilization. So welcome, Daniel. How are you?
Hello. Yeah, I'm fine, thanks. How are you, Johan?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah. So why don't we get stuck in, and you can tell me. Well, first of all, tell me about the first part of the title, "A Gift for Treason." What's that about?
Well, that's essentially a reference to the fact that I think that the other side in the kind of culture war that the book discusses are much better at this game than we are. There's a Cicero quote that's given at the beginning of the book as well, which is about how a society can suffer its fools and its enemies, but not necessarily survive its traitors.
Okay.
There is a kind of concerted effort to work against Western civilization as a whole within Western civilization now. That was the prompt for the book, and that's really what's being referenced in the title, because you have to acknowledge that the people who are doing this are very good at it, and at the moment there's a culture war that's waging, and in my opinion it's the other side, the side that hates Western civilization, that is winning, and that's quite clear if you look at the social changes that have happened in the last 5 decades, even in the last 5 years. They've all been going in one direction essentially, and it's not in a direction that favors Western civilization.
Okay, and I guess this connects to what they call the long march through the institutions. Yeah, would you say so?
Absolutely, that's a key part of it, and I think that the conceptual difference, if you like, is that those who oppose Western civilization very early on thought about how they would do it and wrote down how they would do it. You've got people like Saul Alinsky, Rules for
Yeah.
Radicals, which was hugely influential. You've got earlier than that, you've got Long March Through the Institutions beginning, and you've got Marxists and communists of various types, who were very methodical and very organized about what they would do and how they would do it. And the people on the other side, the people who defend Western civilization and value its heritage, have been playing catch up for 50 years, and they've been responding to threats rather than being a threat to the opposition themselves. And that's why we've seen this. People talk about the shift of the Overton window. That's why we've seen this enormous shift to the left over years, because the right have largely been responsive but not proactive, and the left, and what's now become a kind of mainstream contestation of Western civilization, have been proactive. And the book is about that, really, and seeking to define a few terms about that conflict.
Okay, so I'm just going to pause you there for a second. I think because it was a bit glitchy, I think if we're going to have to figure out how to get you recording your screen, just in case.
Right, okay.
So
Did it go out a few
yeah, it
points
did. I
there
mean,
then,
I
or?
heard everything, but it was very, very glitchy.
Right, okay.
So, are there? What do you have on your menu at the bottom?
I've got nothing at the bottom at all. I've got a little image of me at the bottom,
Okay.
and I've got you filling the majority of the screen, which is lovely. Um, and at the top, I've got
Oh, is it on a mobile
sort of
device or
details.
a
It's on my iPad.
iPad? Oh, maybe the iPad can't record. Okay. Okay, I guess we'll just have to go along with it, and
Yeah, we'll have to cut out obviously when you do your editing, you have to cut out the glitchy
yeah.
bits and leave only what makes me look great, and you'll have a wonderful 45 seconds to play with. Um, so
Okay, so let's get to the second part, and obviously the key element there is cultural Marxist, and I've kind of moved away from that term given the negative connotations, but there are many ways, I think, or many aspects to that concept, which include intersectionality, critical theory, wokeness, what else? Grievance studies. There's a sort of an array of concepts which
gender
gender
studies.
studies, yeah, they all sort of tie in. But maybe if you explain what, because that was the word that you used and why you've used.
Yeah, well, I used the word cultural Marxism because I knew it had negative connotations, and that, as it happens with so many things now, people were alleging that this was uh, a phrase loaded with negative meanings that shouldn't be deployed. But it does seem pretty accurate to me in describing the nature of the opposition we
Mhm.
face. Um, and it links back to in 1984, there was a Edward G. Griffin interview with a KGB defector called Yuri
Oh
Bezmenov.
yeah.
And in that interview, Bezmenov outlined, and there's a chapter in my book on this, Bezmenov had outlined what the KGB strategy was for the end of the Cold War. And he stated essentially that Soviet leaders towards the end of the Cold War acknowledged and recognized that they were losing the battle against the West, economically and militarily, that they couldn't fight on those terms. And, there was unlikely to be a large scale military conflict that they could win, because of mutually assured destruction. And there was unlikely to be some kind of economic triumph where scores of countries decided actually communism is a better system than capitalism. So they needed an alternative front on which to fight the battle. And, essentially the battle between a communist style of leadership and a capitalist Western style of leadership. And Bezmenov asserted that they made this choice, a deliberate choice, to look at Western civilization, look at the flaws within it, so the disagreements, the disparities, and exploit those. And it would be a cultural front in the communist war against the West. Um, and they deliberately targeted, KGB agents deliberately targeted universities as the kind of seedbed of this operation. Now, obviously, there's a degree to which Bezmenov was exaggerating KGB influence and KGB power, because you'd have to be a fantasist to really suppose that every academic in the West who started writing against the values had been contacted by a KGB agent. But you don't need that. You just need to embed the ideas and let them spread themselves. Um, and so cultural Marxism refers to that process. And it's also the case that lots of the people who object to Western civilization share key ideas and key modes of thinking with um, communism,
Mm.
essentially, because if you look at, communism has this idea of historical determinism. The march of progress is inevitably going towards communism, and the proletariat will rise, and there's really nothing that capitalism can do about this because it's an inherent process that can't be avoided, and that's why the march of communism will succeed. So that historical determinism is a key feature of the thinking of woke people today, or people who oppose the West in various forms today. Um,
Yeah, there was this.
they think likewise.
Yeah, there was this great
Sorry, go
moment
ahead.
in. I guess you saw the. Did you see the Zizek Peterson interview debate that they had? And Zizek goes along and he says, "Who are these cultural Marxists that you keep referring to in your with all his charisma. He's quite charismatic, and then
Yeah.
I saw a few memes going around by more left wing friends saying like Peterson didn't have a good answer to that, but I thought his answer. I rewatched it again recently, just that segment, and I thought his answer was pretty solid because he refers back to, which you go to in your book. He refers back to thinkers from the like the Frankfurt School and obviously Derrida and Foucault. Yeah, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about those characters from the French philosophers from the 1960s.
Well, the French influence on this is enormous because France has always had a good record in terms of philosophy and culture. For a couple of centuries, it was de rigueur to use French as your language of intellectual debate.
Okay.
It was one of the main places where the Enlightenment took place, obviously, as well. So you've got figures like Descartes.
Mm.
But the influence of the post-structuralists has been enormous and that's a movement that essentially was primarily French. Their influence in the critical thinking of, say, things like literature studies has been enormous. And it has spread from there to society at large, essentially. So you've got figures like Derrida, and you've got figures like Lacan, and probably the most important and the most influential of all in terms of how social changes have gone is Foucault.
So
And
with Foucault, we're talking about mainly power. Everything has to be seen through the lens of power structures. So when we get referring back to the cultural Marxist concept, it's that the as you kind of alluded to, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie have now been replaced by sort of colored and white people and male and female, gay and straight, and so the we have a new oppressor and a new oppressed, and in many ways, and this is what Zizek was sort of pointing to as well. It's not Marxist in the economic sense because sort of all white working class men, for example, would not be included as the oppressed because now they are the oppressor according to these.
Absolutely, and in some ways, I mean, I've got a very intelligent friend who nevertheless considers himself, I think, a Marxist. And his argument is that, the one that's always provided is that you don't judge Marxism by its worst excesses, because we don't judge capitalism that way, for example,
Right.
or at least unless we're one of the woke, we don't. But uh, the point is also that Western civilization had a series of values that weren't really definitively questioned until the French Revolution. And then they're questioned in the French Revolution, and you get this whole Enlightenment idea of constructing a new society based on rational principles. And post-structuralism is a shift in the entire conception of Western values that's as significant as that shift of the Enlightenment was, and it's as radical and it's as potentially dangerous in terms of what happens next, because we saw the French Revolution, and this kind of extreme version of rationalism led to the terror, and now we're seeing the irrationalism of post-structuralism, which is essentially the idea that everything that has gone before is a power structure that needs to be toppled. And well, you say that's all well and good, but it's a conception of the relations between society and individuals that's the same as Marxism. Because if you're asserting, right, first of all, there's historical determinism, we are the march of progress, we are progressive, you're saying that things will inevitably go your way. So the things you're doing to make that happen are somehow justified by history itself, because history is going in this direction anyway. that obviously allows you to justify various evils. But you say that, and then you say everything that is traditional or everything that stands against your viewpoint is some kind of unjust, unfair, oppressive power structure, then again, you're justified in taking your responses to that to any extreme. So it's incredibly dangerous in both senses, and it's exactly like Marxism in both senses. And that's why I use the phrase cultural Marxism still, even though people have objected to it, and even though it covers very disparate groups with different aims themselves.
Right.
You know, and you know, maybe we could discuss some of the differences between those. But the reason cultural Marxism applies is because the things that the woke are doing now and the beliefs that they're supporting and the things that people who hate Western civilization are supporting are saying reflect these basic principles of Marxism on a cultural front. It's a transition of the war from economics to culture.
Great. And so yeah, I have some a, a concept here which you mentioned in your book. I think you referred to it as the somewheres and the nowheres, but some people refer to it as the somewheres and the anywheres. Can you tell us
Yes.
about that? Because I feel like as I grew up, I was definitely one of the anywheres, and I traveled a lot, and I probably would have been very pro EU back then, and slowly, sort of through, I wasn't really that interested in philosophy or politics. I was more interested in creativity and having a laugh and stuff like that. But then I think it's just slowly crept up on it's crept up on us to such a point where everything is influenced by politics. You go to the cinema and there's politics in there, and
Yeah.
but anyway, let's go back to the somewhere and anywhere point.
You can't watch anything without there being a political viewpoint being expressed to you at the moment, and that's probably one way. Ironically, that's one way in which people like critical race theorists and uh, post-structuralists are correct. You know, politics is suffused through everything, but part of that has largely been initiated by their
Right,
efforts. It's suffused for everything now because they're making
right.
everything
So it's a
political.
self-fulfilling prophecy,
You know,
basically.
I mean, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and one of the, you know, one of the kind of ludicrous things I'm doing at the moment is keeping a list of everything I find that somebody describes as racist, and it covers the whole of human
I know.
existence now. You know, it's not just kind of statues and I don't know, if you think the legal system is racist. You know, the other day the BBC journalist said British gardening was inherently racist
Yeah, I've seen that.
because it uses terms like heritage.
Ah,
Yeah, and this has got to a point where these people don't realise it's a manifestation of their paranoia and their delusion. You know, because they're constantly looking at things and saying, "See, look, I told you, racism is everywhere."
I think.
And they don't realise that it's because they're applying that racism
Yeah, I
everywhere.
think. Well, it's the work of James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, which I'm sure you're aware of. Uh, they
Yeah,
they say, yeah, the question is no longer does racism take place in the situation. It's how does racism take place in the situation. And when you put the how there, it's like, okay, we're going to just assume that there's racism in the situation, and then now we just have to find it. And so the example he gives is, yeah, if you're for example, a shopkeeper, probably a white shopkeeper in this example, and a white person and a black person come in the shop at the same time, do you serve the white person first or the black person first? If you serve the black person first, you are trying to serve them quickly and get them out of your store as quickly as possible. Therefore, you're a racist. If
yeah,
you serve the white
yeah.
person first, you have a preference for white people. Therefore, you're racist. So all roads lead back to to racism.
Yeah, and it's the same logic applied, but this is, you know, Soviet show trials applied this logic to
Mm,
people. You know, if you associated with so and so who had already been condemned as a traitor, then obviously that proved you're a traitor. If you didn't associate with him, then you were deliberately avoiding him to disguise your own treason. Therefore, you're a traitor. Let's shoot you.
right.
And and witch trials applied the same logic. The kind of if the trial by water, where you chuck them in the water, and if they sink and drown, then they're innocent, but it doesn't do them much
Yeah.
good. If they float,
Of
obviously they're
course. Yeah.
guilty, and then you
Yeah.
kill
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. That's a good example.
That is the kind of logic that's applied, or lack of logic. And of course, now we see that logic itself is described as one of the tools of repression.
Hmm.
So it's perfectly okay if my argument makes no sense, by your white man's logic, because
And that's not in the
because
slightest bit offensive to brown or black people who like logic and who think it's a good way.
yes, I know, and it's not as if there's ever been any kind of logical thinkers who aren't white. But if you look at all of these kind of forms of thinking, by any of the rational criteria that used to be applied, they're immediately destroyed, and they're immediately absurd.
Mm.
Um, you know, uh, One of the things, if you're talking about critical race
Mm.
theory, that was kind of created by a number of people, but probably the most influential was Derek Bell,
Oh yeah.
who was a Harvard law professor. Um, so one of the things that he stated was that if white people ever advocate for black people or for minorities, it's out of self-interest. They will only ever advocate for the rights of others based on their own self-interest. Um, and that is patently untrue. If you look at history, and if you look at people, for example, um, white people who joined the civil rights movement, you know, there wasn't any direct selfish benefit to them as individuals in doing that. Very rarely was there. And if you look at, there was no reason for people, by pure self-interest in the UK, for example, to oppose apartheid in South Africa. They gained no immediate benefit to themselves by doing so. Um, and obviously, as well, it's a form of thinking that is immediately doing what it claims white people do, because it's immediately seeing all white people as a monolithic block who all think exactly the same way and act exactly the same way.
Yeah.
And so, you kind of look at what the key ideas of something like critical race theory are, and they're irrational and hypocritical from the offset. And they're disproven by history. That any case in which any white person has been altruistic towards any non-white person disproves a key idea of critical race theory immediately.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that could bring us onto the book White Privilege, which I haven't actually read, but I understand the main concept of it, which is basically white people are just racist, and if either they fall into the category of I'm an openly racist, whatever, redneck, neo-Nazi, or whatever, and
Yeah,
or they could say, actually, I'm not racist. Sorry, you're wrong, and then that defensiveness is further evidence of their racism. So again, it's the same sort of formula where all roads lead to racism. If and then
I know, and you absolutely cannot win.
yeah,
As a white non-racist, you can never you can never win in this kind of discussion,
yeah,
because the parameters have already been set that whatever you say or whatever you do or however you respond, you are a racist. And, doing that is itself inherently
yes,
racist.
definitely,
Saying I'm going to prejudge everything this person says by their skin color, by their ethnic background, um, and I'm going to blame them for every kind of instance of racism from their race in history as
mm.
well, as if they are somehow culpable for that. That's inherently racist itself. So there's absolutely no way to win logically or rationally in a debate with people who think like that and people who believe that.
Yeah. I guess this ties in with Lawrence Fox's infamous conversation on Question Time, where he said, no, actually, what you've just said is racist, and he kind of he's just trying to embody Martin Luther King's vision of judging people by the content of their character and not the color of their skin or any other immutable characteristic. And that now is the that was once, for me, that's the ideal of a civil rights movement. And that's when the civil rights movement was at its strongest. And then now, and I think Douglas Murray makes a very good point when he says, when he, what's the reference, when he talks about St. George trying to slay a dragon, and then once he slayed the dragon, he, he's got nothing else to do, so he starts envisioning these dragons and then just trying to slay them, and then by the end he's just like swinging his sword wildly in the air. And
well, that's a bit similar to the kind of Cervantes idea of tilting at
okay,
windmills,
maybe
isn't
that's
it?
where he got it from. Yeah.
Don Quixote kind of attacking these windmills, thinking they're giants,
Okay. Yeah.
and he's operating by his delusion, and he sees giants everywhere, and it's a bit, it's similar with kind of critical race theory and with wokeness in general. It's a paranoid conspiracy theory of it in itself, because it's, if once you get to the stage where you think that every white person is inherently and automatically working against every person of color, which is the assumption that is being operated by, once you think that, there's very little distinction between that attitude towards white people, and I'm fully aware of Godwin's law, and I'm fully aware of, the response to this that would come. But there's no distinction between that kind of thinking about white people and Nazi attitudes towards Jewish people. It's the same thing. If you think that there is a racial conspiracy against you in which all white people are operative, consciously or unconsciously, you are thinking the same thing about white people that the Nazis thought about Jews. And we know the historical consequences of that. So it really is that dangerous, and it really is that hypocritical, that judgmental, and that antithetical to actually treating people with justice and kindness.
So yeah, it seems to be a modern day form of divide and rule. It's let's just divide I mean, identity politics is exactly that. It's let's divide everyone based on their immutable characteristics. And that's how they seem to be getting power, because they sow these divisions. There was a time when, growing up, I did feel different based on my skin tones, but then I don't know when that feeling disappeared, but eventually that sort of disappeared. And then in the last sort of 3-5 years, it's suddenly become something I'm conscious of again because of all of these movements. And it's, I think we were getting close, and then now it's like we've taken a lot of steps back, and this is mainly coming from the
That
radical left.
Absolutely, and that's the tragedy of it, really, because the history of Western civilization up until this point, essentially, with the exception, obviously, of what happened in the 1930s, but the overall history of Western civilization is a movement towards enfranchisement and genuine progress, and giving more people more rights all the time. That's the movement. That is the history of the West.
Actually,
Um,
I've got a
you
quote
know,
here from you, from your book, which I think ties in with what you're just saying. I'll just read it out.
yeah, I always love hearing myself quoted, so I'm going to enjoy this.
Oh yeah, here we go. Western civilization, by spreading capitalism, democracy, and the keys to its own success to others, has significantly extended the average human lifespan and improved the average conditions under which all human beings live.
Absolutely, and those are facts. Those are established facts. You can't dispute that. Say one of the kind of key aspects of Western civilization, capitalism, has improved average life expectancy across the globe. It's done so. It's irrefutable. All the studies
And
show
it's
that.
doing so as
If you
well.
want
It's
to
continuing
drill
indeed.
down, and it's doing so. It's doing so in an ongoing fashion. Yes. So if you look at life expectancy, if you look at educational attainment, if you look at things like medical advances, this is a history of continued progress, for, with, yes, incredibly violent setbacks, and yes, injustices took place, but they will do under any human system there is. And what you've got to function with as a person, as a practical individual on a planet that we all share, is which systems work the best, not which utopian vision do I want to adhere to, even if it costs the lives of others. And that's your choice, which is working. And capitalism isn't perfect. Western civilization hasn't been perfect, but it works better than the alternatives. And the alternatives more often have led to death camps than Western civilization has.
Yeah, and I think, for me, one of the things that really shocked me when I went to Peru and went to the Inca, territories, you kind of have this vision, and this is about the Spanish Empire really, but you have this vision that
Yeah.
the Spanish just came in and everything was sort of this. It was like the noble savages before that, and they were all just living in harmony.
Yeah. The Rousseau's
Yeah,
idea.
exactly. And then
Yeah. Rousseau's
and
idea.
then
Yeah.
um, and then you get then you, and then you find out from the history. Well, actually, the Incas were brutal, had a brutal empire themselves, and it was only 100 years before the Spanish that they reached the peak of their sort of empire, and it kind of,
Well, the Incas were actually far less brutal than the
of course, yeah,
Aztecs, and there's some both empires destroyed by the Spanish, but it is obvious that the Spanish conquest of South America by contemporary standards could be considered brutal and was brutal. Um, but these weren't noble savages that were being displaced. Human sacrifice was an endemic and necessary and absolutely vital part of Aztec civilization. Are we going to say that kind of conquistadors were somehow inherently evil, and their descendants are to be blamed for
mm,
that? Whereas, carving someone's heart out on temple steps was perfectly fine, and a kind of wonderful and noble
yeah,
expression of a society that was tragically brought short by
yeah,
others. If you look at the kind of numbers of conquistadors as well, you know, you've got something like 500
yeah. The
people
numbers below.
dis- destroying an entire civilization. And they could only do that because that civilization was itself built on injustices and ready to fall.
So yeah, I mean,
You know, the
from my own background in evolutionary psychology, we look a lot at the hunter gatherer world, and again,
yeah,
it completely demolishes the Rousseauian idea of the noble savage, because some of the best estimates for homicide in those communities were like 30%. So even if you take all of the 20th century into account, uh, the mortality rate from murder or war was nothing like a 30% amount. And so we've come through that
yeah,
violence, and um, you can also see this in chimpanzees, where actually one of the studies I read, it was a group of chimpanzees, it was a group of 14, and for whatever reason they divided into two subgroups, one of 8 and one of 6, and then they became, because they were competing against each other, even though they were once allies, they would actually just go and brutally murder one of the group of 8. Some of the group of 8 brutally murdered one of the group of 6, and so this, this, it's as if the vision is that there's all been this harmonious sort of Noah like harmony through society all the way through till what the white male patriarchy or Western civilization. And
yeah. Because until the evil white man ruined it all.
yeah,
Yeah, with our extension of voting rights and being the kind of first people, apart from Ashoka, to really work against slavery.
yeah.
You know,
Oh, I was not aware of Ashoka. He
our
was the Buddhist leader in
in
India.
India, yeah, and he's a very interesting historical case because he's a very early example of somebody actually outlawing
Oh,
slavery.
I didn't know that about him. Yeah,
Um, you know, he had been a conqueror. He had been the kind of
Mm,
traditional ruler of the ancient world who is judged on his success by how many people he then gets to control, not on how morally he rules. Um, you know, the very early example of someone who's saying, actually, I've had this religious conversion because he converted to
yeah,
Buddhism, and it's changed my moral framework, and I oppose slavery and I oppose exploitation.
right.
And you know, he became a completely different figure to the one he was before that conversion. It's almost like the kind of mirror opposite of what happened with Muhammad,
Yeah,
really.
seems so.
Um,
Yeah.
you know, because you've got very early teachings from Muhammad that are peaceful, but they're superseded by what he found to be more effective and to get him far more followers, which was teachings that basically endorse violence and endorse the treatment of non-Muslims as subhuman.
Mm. And I mean, I guess from the survival of the fittest point of view, the sort of warring style is the one that's more likely to survive in the sense of you know, aggressor or passive. You know, it's unfortunately it's a mechanism that does that will sort of preserve itself and like that as well, I would say.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. I mean, when you're talking about the broad sweep of history, it's a very interesting kind of area to debate, but it's also one that kind of while you're debating, you might suffer from if your civilization
Yeah.
collapses. You know, you might be talking about all this, and then the door's broken
Yes,
down.
it's true.
You
It's
know,
true.
hopefully that won't happen during this podcast, but
No, it's not live.
um, to either of us. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I mean, fiction. There's talk about this as well. You know, Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan. You know, he had the idea uh, that civilizations inevitably became corrupt and
Oh
decadent,
yeah, I've heard about
and
this. Yeah.
you know, it's a very kind of 1930s idea, very 1930s idea that the kind of civilizations inherently will become corrupt. You know, and it informed the political movements of the time, but it also informed fiction of the time, and a lot of this kind of stuff that people don't realize, the kind of cultural and political trends it's discussing. You know, you've got a figure like Conan, who's still kind of a popular known figure today, and you might get films made about him, or you know, the fantasy literature. There's this whole kind of the strong-hued barbarian warrior is a kind of key figure in that, who's kind of acting against the perverse and the decadent civilized people. You know, these feed into cultural ideas all over the place. Um, you know, another one that was interesting is very kind of divergent from what we were talking about in a way, but it's interesting psychologically to me. Is if you look at how prevalent superhero movies are at the moment and the whole kind of Marvel, Disney superhero themes. Well, when did superhero movies emerge? In the 1930s, 1938, I think was the Action Comics #1 was released. So you could just before Nazism, just before World War II, rather, you know, you've had Nazism in power from 1933, and you've had the Great Depression, and suddenly you get a form of fiction that is all about ordinary people suddenly acquiring enormous power,
Right.
you know, and it's all about being super, being incredibly powerful, and being able to right wrongs directly yourself through those kind of superhuman means. And you know, when people are disconnected from politics, when they're suffering, when they're not listened to, then fiction of that kind becomes prevalent in your society because it's giving them a fictional outlet and a fictional form of power that they can identify with. You know, you get Superman because you've got the Great Depression.
Yeah, that's
It's
interesting.
not
Yeah.
that direct and that simple, but that's the psychological impetus there.
So let's just go back a touch because we didn't quite because I think I brought in two ideas with the somewheres and the anywheres, or somewheres and nowheres.
Yes, and we didn't really
No,
discuss
yeah,
that
just are
fully,
you a
did we?
somewhere,
So,
or are you an anywhere, or are you a nowhere? I think it was somewheres,
um,
and you wrote nowheres, but some people also write anywheres. So yeah.
yes, yeah, yeah. Um, but I mean, anywhere would be the idea. I'm a citizen of the
Right.
world, you know, which is all well and good as an ideal, and it's all well and good in the same way that you say I'm a human being and they're a human being, you know. But in practical reality, there is a distinction between the human being who is, for example, Jeffrey Dahmer, and the human being who is, uh, for example, Mother
Yeah.
Teresa. You know, it takes no account, and it doesn't really get you anywhere to say these are human beings. And it takes no account, it doesn't really get you anywhere to say we are all human beings on the same planet. You know, yes, it's true. And yes, in an ideal world, we'd all be functioning morally as if it's true, but we aren't. And when other people aren't, you're just foolish and naive at best to be functioning on that premise and on that
Mm.
basis. Because, you know, there are cultural differences between people. There are societies in which, um, you know, things which would be classified as evil in some societies are not classified as
Right. Yeah.
evil. You know, and it runs through many different things. You know, you've got things like the age of consent.
Oh, yeah.
Well, what do you do if you've got two different societies, two different groups of people with radically different ideas on what the age of consent should
Mm.
be, and at what point someone can give consent to sexual
Mm.
activity? You know, you've got an inherent problem there. If you're saying that these people from one location with say who think that 12 years old is fine to have sexual relations, and you've got people from another location who think that sort of 16 is the age at which people can give informed sexual consent, you've automatically got a problem there, and you can't dismiss the problem even before you get onto issues like rape. Just an issue of what everyone understands to be the lawful and the reasonable and the moral
Mm.
approach, you've got a problem, and you have to acknowledge that problem.
Yeah, and I think this concept ties in with again another evolved psychological mechanism, which is which ties in with the chimpanzee point I was discussing earlier, where it's like we do have whether it's a football team or
I feel that you're, you know, being very hard on chimpanzees at the moment,
I know I'm a
and
chimpanzophobe, but
yes,
yeah, it's an in-group out-group mentality, which it could be a football team, it could be almost like a city or a nation, and it's so inbuilt in us to have that. And
it's there anyway, and it will be displayed and is being displayed most by the people who claim it isn't there.
mm,
You know, so you know from your background in evolutionary psychology that this in-group out-group preference is real.
mm,
um, the people who say that they are getting rid of in-group out-group preference are just displaying a new form of in-group out-group
mm,
preference. You know, their in-group is other members of the woke,
yeah,
and they are actively persecuting people who aren't in that group, silencing them, demonizing them, removing them from jobs. You know, so they're doing all the activities of an in-group whilst claiming that they oppose that psychological process, or that that psychological process isn't real. Um, and that's the same issue with somewheres and nowheres, or somewheres and anywheres. You know, we live in a world where these things do exist and do happen, and to pretend they don't is essentially meaningless. And you know, you asked me whether I'm a somewhere or a anywhere or a nowhere. I'm definitely a somewhere. You know, I identify strongly with the UK, and specifically with England. You know, I have a very romantic vision of what England is and what has England has contributed to the world, and I'm, unashamed in that. So I'm a nationalist, and I'm also a libertarian to a large extent. So those two things can logically conflict at
Mm.
times, but I see nothing wrong in identifying with a place and see the expression of your personal history, and it being tied in with your family. The idea that the bones of my ancestors are buried in this land is not inherently an evil idea. It's inspired a lot of good as well as a lot of evil. So it's a kind of it's an idea that's true to a large extent, I feel.
Yeah, I think for me, I think I've become a somewhere, even though for long periods of my life I wasn't anywhere, and I think that's also just come through this, yeah, this sort of looking through videos on the internet and reading more about British culture. So for example, a point that you mentioned earlier was the slave trade, and it was only reading Thomas Sowell, who we are both big fans of, that I
Yeah,
discovered that actually, yeah, the British found them. First of all, they had to find a moral argument against slavery, which stemmed
yeah.
from the Enlightenment, and then from that moral argument, it was let's impose this, and then it was imposed on America. It was imposed on the Arabic world, who didn't like it, and the French Empire, and it was like a pioneering.
And South America, one of the last places to outlaw slavery was Brazil.
Right.
Um, you know, um, South America traded heavily with the British Empire, and it was the British who built the railways in many South American countries, as they did in India and elsewhere. Um, so Britain applied economic and military power to end slavery across the globe. And without the existence, the irony is, without the existence of the British Empire, the end of slavery as a large scale uh, part of the global economy would have taken much longer. Because British Navy ships, for example, went and seized ships that were transporting slaves and freed those slaves. And this is history that isn't taught, and especially isn't taught by people who are followers of critical race
Yeah,
theory.
I mean, I've heard arguments as well about India. Like India would have been the richest country in the world had it not been taken over by the British Empire. But then it's just like I think it's such a flawed argument, because every empire in history has to play the game between economic growth and defense. And if you're not going to spend anything on, or if you're not going to have your defense force, then that's a cost that you may end up having to pay for as a consequence of the world that of empires which existed after the agricultural revolution. That's when it all began, and then between like then and now, yeah, it was always an interplay between the two. And I think even now with America, a lot of people see America as a force of evil, but actually a lot of countries don't invest in their again they don't invest in their military, and America foots the bill for all of that. And
Well, that's the NATO effect,
mm,
isn't it? And that was one of the arguments Trump had with European leaders, because European leaders for 70 years since World War II had expected America to foot the bill for their defence. And there are obvious historic reasons why maybe after World War II, a lot of people in nations other than Germany were quite happy to see Germany with a small military. Um, but uh, that's 70 years ago, and Germany still expects, and France to an extent, although France have one of the bigger militaries in the EU. Um, the You can't expect people abroad to fund your
mm.
defence. Why? Why should they? 70 years after World War II, and um, long after the end of the Cold War as well. You can't be expecting Americans to foot the bill for European defence. And why should you? Um,
And I think
But
this is one of the things that I liked most about Trump was his non-intervention, not starting any more wars, because it 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 seems like we've had this phase of bombing countries and then just opening the doors to immigration, and like obviously Germany did the most for the migrant crisis to enable it. But yeah, you can't do both. You can't, and it seems like
well, isn't there a there's a perverse contradiction in how people talk about this as well, because with the Trump example, yeah, he's the first US president in decades not to start a new war. And all the people who 30 years ago would have been on CND marches and described themselves as pacifists, and the people who claim that they're against kind of things like military industrial complexes, um, give him no credit for that
well,
at
yeah,
all. No credit
not
at
all
all.
people, because I was I was back in my hippie type days. I was on those marches. I was on the Iraq
Yeah,
War march, and then yeah, I feel like I've just retained that principle. But a lot of the people
yeah.
around me have just gone bananas about Trump. But I've retained that principle of non-intervention is the way forwards, even though I was technically marching against a dictator being removed from office, which was Saddam. But at the same time, I still have a nuanced position where the core value of not intervening, and not, because the those power structures have arisen very much like in the Godfather, in the book, where when the Godfather is in control, there's no street crime in
Yep.
and then when the five families go to war with each other, and there's all this conflict, that's when the street crime starts rising. So in many ways, a lot of these countries like Iraq, they almost need that very strong pyramid structure where everyone knows who's boss, and actually on the streets, people can actually just, even though it's a dictatorship, people can get on with their lives, even though they live in fear. But obviously it's not an ideal situation, but when you topple that,
Again, it's not. Yeah, you get chaos and you get anarchy, and we've seen the consequence of that in Iraq and in Syria. And this was a neoliberal hawks, they're called in the US. This was a neoliberal policy platform, which, if Joe Biden is president, will be returned to, and it was utterly disastrous. There's this is again a contradiction. If you compare what the people who say that they are all for human compassion and kindness to others, and we're all this on this big globe, that we're all the same and we're all human beings, why would you then support massive bombing campaigns against other nations? Why would you support
yeah.
that? Um, and it's not as if these nations have um, uh, already entered into a war with you and then you're responding, say like you know say for example during World War II, Britain responded to the Blitz with the bombing of Dresden. um, that precedent hasn't been established by your enemy. um, and even things like, if you use I was against the Iraq war because the evidence was very weak. And it's since emerged that, like Russian collusion with Trump, the evidence was based on a dodgy
Yeah.
dossier. Um, and Western civilization as a whole, the inheritance of Western civilization would tell you to look at the evidence and apply some logic.
Well, I
Um,
wasn't planning on
but
going
we
here
don't.
with this now, but well, let you finish your point, and then maybe we can talk about the the evidence going on
Yeah,
right
sure.
now in the American elections. But yeah, go on.
Yeah, because that inheritance of logic would have told you, well, I can see the evidence that they presented, and it's not very strong. This idea that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which was since proved to be false, um, that the evidence for that was never strong. Um, the idea that things would be improved by a massive military intervention at that point was weak or non-existent. So I oppose those things on both logical and moral grounds. And a supposedly left-wing but neoliberal prime minister was enthusiastically lying to everybody to get that war to go ahead, you know, and Trump reversed those policies. And it's something he's got very little credit for from the people who claim that they love the whole world but are happy with Obama, for example, who launched massive bombing campaigns, you know, and it's startling, this moral
I think
distinction
that was
where
after he won his
they
Nobel
can
Peace Prize, right?
despise. That was, yeah. So maybe he was making sure the Nobel Peace Prize
Yeah.
first, and then you do things like, you know,
And
I mean, one of my, it's facetious, but one of my friends put this picture of Obama dancing, you know, really enthusiastically. He's really got into it, and my friend put the comment, who's a very, very highly intelligent guy. He put the comment, when the beat drops as hard as those bombs you dropped on a Yemeni wedding.
wow.
um, and it's a brutal comment, but it does tell you the kind of moral absurdity going on here with people who think, you know, oh, Trump's evil for the wall and Trump's evil for the cages with children are in.
Mm,
The cages were a Obama
mm,
policy. They were, you know, the cages were made under Obama.
mm,
Um, Joe Biden and Obama are both on record supporting border controls, you know, on the same board, but suddenly it becomes evil when Trump does it. You know, they are part of an administration. Biden was vice president during an administration that dropped more bombs than were dropped on Vietnam.
wow.
And
So why do you think
they are morally good.
the rules of power don't apply? So we talked about oppressed and oppressor. Why would you say it is when, like, for example, Democrats who are, for example, pro-war, and why is it when they are in power they are not seen as powerful or
Because being on that side has been uh, described as and promoted as a shortcut to virtue. And virtue is actually hard and difficult and requires individual
mm,
action. You know, I'm not virtuous because I'm white, and someone else is not virtuous because they're
mm,
brown. And, you know, an individual policy isn't virtuous because it's from a Democrat, or virtuous because it's from a
mm,
Republican, or in the UK, Labour or Conservative. It's virtuous based on, did it cost you something, and has it benefited others?
mm,
That's how you really detect
yeah,
virtue. But that's not how virtue is being detected today. Virtue is being detected solely by this side of good and this side of evil. And it's an incredibly attractive shortcut
yeah,
for, you know, for the woke. You've got this wonderful system that tells you that no matter how you behave as an individual, you are virtuous and you are good because you publicly state the things that are themselves considered virtuous and good. So you can be Bill Clinton, and your attitude towards women can be a little bit suspect, you know, or you could be Harvey Weinstein, and your attitude towards women is more than a little bit suspect, you know. But you say the right things, or you did until the kind of it comes out and the evidence
yeah, yeah,
emerges. You say the right things about female empowerment. You know, you might use the word empowerment a lot, um, and so therefore you're virtuous. And similarly, if you happen to be a very little bit rapey as a person yourself, as an individual, you can express all these fine feelings about female empowerment whilst you're behaving in exactly the opposite
yeah, yeah,
manner. And lots of other people will tell you that you are
yeah, yeah.
virtuous,
I mean,
you know, so that's the
yeah.
attraction of it.
Again, it also ties in with evolutionary principles, which is the idea of the honest signal. So, an honest signal is something that, by definition, cannot be faked. So, for example, and this is one that actually puzzled Darwin quite a lot, which is the evolution of the peacock's plumage, and
Yep.
it's an honest signal in the sense that in that environment where full of predators, uh, if you are a male who has one of the most dazzling plumages out there, then it's actually a bit like having a siren on your head saying, "Predators, look at me,
Yeah.
here I am," you know, and
Hey, the lengths us males will go to get laid, we will risk
yeah,
death. We will. It doesn't matter what species it is.
yeah.
You
So,
know?
so yeah, it's such an honest signal that when a female sees that, and they say, well, their biology sort of says to them, you know, this guy, you know, he's the most dazzling, and because he's the mere fact that he's in existence, despite his tail, despite his handicap, as Amot Sahavi would put it, despite all of that, he is still alive. Therefore, he must have good genes. Because originally it was a bit of a paradox for Darwin, because most species evolve camouflage and they want to blend in with the
Yeah.
environment, whether it's a hunter or hunted. Whereas this was a very much a paradox for natural selection, and it actually led to his second book, The Descent of Man, which was more about sexual selection. And so yes, a lot of these um, a lot of these things that politicians do, like changing their their gender pronouns or whatever, it's just the weakest form of virtue signaling.
Well, also, it's as well. It's unlike the peacock. There's no cost to them.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, there's nobody taking pot shots or deciding that that peacock is going to be their
Mm.
meal based on this virtual
Yeah.
signal. So there's no, if you like, there's no evolutionary cost to
No,
them for
there
doing
isn't.
this. And you know, and it's a great distraction as well. You know, people ask why, for example, would a large corporation go woke? Why would Nike or Adidas or you know, Haagen-Dazs? Why would
It was Ben
a
and Jerry's,
company
wasn't
that's,
it? But yeah,
yeah, Ben
yeah,
and Jerry's or whatever, you know, why would a company that's selling ice cream want to give you a political
mm,
message? Because they know that political message is inherently going to put off half the people that are out there listening. You know, and why would you know, somewhere like Sainsbury's or Tesco's
mm,
start making these political messages? Well, it's the same thing. It's peacock's feathers, because it signals virtue to the people they want to appeal
yeah.
to. And they don't want to appeal to the ordinary consumer anymore, because that's not where the money is. You know, and in the book, I say, you know, why are there woke corporations? Um, it's because most of the money and power in our society today exists with people who are already cultural Marxist and
Mm.
already
But
woke.
what about the get woke, go broke
So you
phenomenon,
don't,
though, which goes against that, I would say.
well, it's happened a few times, but that tends to happen only where the demographic of who your traditional audience is, so who your customers are, is is inherently anti-woke anyway.
Right.
Um, you know, as far as I know, Disney aren't going broke at the moment.
Mm,
You know, and they've gone incredibly woke.
yeah.
Um, as long as you can appeal to enough um, rich people who share your ideas, the excess wealth of that demographic will compensate for a bunch of poor people like me saying, "Oh, well, I'm not going to watch that
Mm,
anymore." You know, because people like me don't have the power. They're appealing to other people who already have the power. You know, and those other people are to them like the female peacock.
but yeah, I would still say that in a in the structure of more like, obviously, capitalist society is more of a pyramid structure. I would say that there is a silent majority who've had enough, and I think that silent majority is beginning to really get their voice. And you know, the internet has democratized a lot of our little conversation. I don't know how it's going to go, but it's still there is a democratization of this, and this conversation will actually be published. You know, so
Absolutely, but you know, certain things we say, it wouldn't be published on. You know, if you start discussing electoral fraud, for
mm,
example, it won't be published on
Oh
YouTube.
yeah, so we better stay away from that.
You know,
Stay away
and
from that topic.
so so you'll be able to put it on an alternative platform
Yeah,
because of capitalism and
right,
competition. But the most powerful platforms are already owned by the woke and owned by cultural
right.
Marxists, and they will enforce their political views on you because it's more important to them to appeal to the large number of people who already favour their politics than it is to accommodate people like you or
Mm.
me.
So I think that's a good point to sort of move into something else. So this is another quote from your book. I want to see a man beaten to a bloody pulp with a high heel shoved in his mouth like an apple in the mouth of a pig. Well, that wasn't actually you. That was Andrea Dworkin.
Yeah,
Some,
yeah. I've I've never had such feelings outside of watching an action movie, you know.
I feel that
But
man-hating is an
yeah,
honourable and viable political act. Robin Morgan.
yeah,
Yeah. So anyway, that this is our segue into feminism. But
yes. Well, again, it connects because one of the radical feminism was gave birth to a lot of against their wishes to not give birth, I suppose, but they gave birth to a lot of the racial theory that's out there now. White privilege was a phrase that had been used by a few others, but was essentially invented by Peggy McIntosh
right. Yeah, you mentioned that. Yeah.
in one article, and I talk about that and so radical feminism and kind of new contemporary woke racism that calls itself anti-racism, they're strongly connected.
Okay, let's go. Well, let's
Um,
lead in with a.
but
We've got a nice quote, a real quote from you, not these radical feminists. Um,
yeah, not these insane women,
okay,
but yeah,
modern feminists no longer address existing injustices against women, since most of these have been addressed or are illusory in Western society, but prefer to create new injustices against men, specifically white men.
yeah. Yeah,
So,
yeah, because that leads into the Peggy McIntosh thing because once you've exhausted, it's a bit like you were saying earlier about Saint George killing the
mm,
dragon. They killed the dragon of any kind of patriarchy if it existed. The Western society definitively moved away from the idea that men were inherently superior to women, and had already done so at the point at which most feminists were taking up their battle. So you could say that before women had the vote, they were disenfranchised, obviously. But once you have the vote, and once you have, the right to own property, and the right to form your own life, and you're beginning to move into various
and I think the
professions,
UK was the first to have equal pay for equal work as well, which is one of the most significant
yeah,
aspects. Which is, again, if that's the form of feminism you're talking about, that I'm 100% behind that. But it seems to have shifted into what they call the third
absolutely,
wave, and it's
absolutely. Yeah, early feminists, as again like the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King had a very good point at that
mm,
stage, and he still does now because he wanted equality, not superiority. Whereas people calling for equality now want superiority, and that's what they're
mm.
getting. Um, and it's the same with feminism, because most of I mean, we mentioned Thomas Sowell earlier, and he did some excellent work on things like the gender wage gap. you know there's logical, rational, completely non-oppressive reasons why the average female pay is lower than the average male pay, and one of those is that more women choose to work for shorter periods of time. More women choose to work uh, in part-time roles, and more women have interruptions to their working career, where they, for example, choose to take time off work and raise a family. Um,
They seem like
and
perfectly
these
good
are
reasons to
Yeah, these are perfectly
yeah.
good reasons, and they're reasons linked to actual factual biology, not to men saying you can't work or men saying you can't progress in this
Mm.
company. You know, it's not. It's certainly not conscious
Yeah,
oppression,
I mean, this
and you
as
know,
you mentioned biology. I mean, again, we can go back to the evolutionary principles, and it's each you know, you could call it the battle of the sexes, but in each species, there's always this. It's almost like they call it an arms race between each gender, and what they're each gender is sort of trying to improve their standing to get more, you know, more opportunities. So from the female side of from the female perspective, because we have male and female selection in humans. So we have the strongest force is female selection, and especially, and this is even stronger in the short-term dating market, where females are the choosers. So
yeah,
this is kind of
I've known that to my cost for many years.
so so anyway, the this this means that men will start looking for the attributes which attract a female. Now, some of those attributes are very much biological. So height, you can't change your height. You can't change. You could probably work on your muscles,
Yeah,
be more muscular. You could probably work on your creativity.
I feel this is getting a bit personal now. I feel this is getting a bit personal.
Anyway, you can work on creativity, intellect. Those are things that you can develop. Whereas, um, but most of the things that determine good genes, which is one of the things that females are looking for, are sort of hardwired, if you like, or genetic. Whereas the other aspect which women are looking for is tied in with status, and in the status sense, that is something which your attitude in the world can really attain, because you can move up competence hierarchies and develop, well, get higher pay, higher salaries, which again is one of the attributes that women look for. Whereas for women, so women are kind of shallow in the sense that they like these all of these attributes, and that they kind of the ideal man has a bit of both. They have the good dad, and they have the good genes, so they have a combo. Whereas for
Yeah,
women, when men are choosing women, uh, the main attribute is genetics, and a key aspect of that is youthfulness, which is a sign of high fertility. And so men and women are sort of have these different trajectories, whereby we know that women spend more on clothes, makeup, and aspects like this,
yeah.
because of the selective pressures of dating that women face, and men are biologically driven towards status, because that is one of the things that, you know. So men are shallow in the sense of visually,
Well,
and women are
I'd
shallow as
say,
well.
I mean, I've always, yeah, I'd say that both genders, you know, as a whole, are
Mm,
shallow, but in different
mm.
ways. And you know, that would be a kind of common sense response, which is particularly evident to any of us who are top quality software in a poor hardware package, such as myself.
Okay, you're very hard on yourself, Daniel.
But you know, you have to be honest about these things, you know, and
But I mean, intelligence
yeah,
is
I think I,
certainly an attribute which separates men as well, which is one of the competence hierarchies.
nobody cares. Nobody cares. That's the one that nobody really cares.
Okay.
You know, I don't care what the studies show. My personal experience, but no, it's you know, and again, going back to the kind of politics of it, it's based on an inherently flawed premise. You know, the whole when you were fighting actual injustices that were there, most people could be on your side. When you start taking those injustices from things that are real, things that everyone can see themselves, to things that you claim exist, but only you can see, and only people who share your politics can see, that's when it becomes ridiculous. And that's when you get things like
Oh yeah.
microaggressions. You know, is there anything more inherently absurd than the idea of or unconscious bias? Unconscious bias. There's no such thing as unconscious bias, in my
No, I think
opinion.
it's been
You
largely
know,
debunked, but yeah, it still persists.
yeah, there's this. But and the people are still operating on this idea that there's unconscious bias. There's no such thing because every bias I have, I'm very, very conscious
Mm.
about. You know, I never find myself saying to myself, "Oh, I was accidentally really against Arsenal that week," and I didn't choose to be that. I didn't choose to be that because I'm a Spurs
Yeah,
fan. I was accidentally doing that, and I was completely unaware of
yeah, yeah,
it.
yeah.
You know, and I don't go out kind of find myself in the middle of the night that I've set up a giant burning cross outside on someone's lawn. I say, oh yes, unconscious bias is
Yeah,
real. I'm doing it
yeah.
now. you know, um, it's an absurdity
It kind of
automatically
brings us back
by any
to
rational.
well, your concepts of cultural Marxism, but also the work of Lindsay and Pluckrose and Bogosian, where they sort of they reference this house of cards that has been built with people like starting with people like Foucault and Derrida, and it's they just refer
Yeah.
back to other articles. I think the media do this as well. So one paper will say something, and then another paper will reference that paper, and then eventually this is sort of how fake news can get spread. And it's the same thing in academia, where yeah, a study can be made,
Oh,
a concept can
absolutely,
be made, like for
absolutely.
example Judith Butler. She came up with the gender performative. So your gender is not determined by your genes. Your gender is determined by your how it's performed by yourself. And again, it's not grounded in research. It's grounded in ideology. And for me, that ideology is
It's nonsense. It's nonsense, and it's and it again, logic and reason and evidence say the opposite, and you can't get out of it by saying logic, reason, and evidence is an invention of the patriarchy or an invention of white races. Because these things, humans discover truth. Humans don't invent truth. And as soon as people started saying, um, my truth is this, or there are these truths of which mine is one, which is what happened after
right.
post-structuralism. Because if you're saying everything is about power and the relation to power between people, then you're also saying that there's no objective reality. There's no shared reality that we all inhabit. For example, a shared meaning of words that have been established over time and are kind of performed in culture all the time. Um, you no longer have to abide by that because anyone telling you, well, actually, that word means this, and here's the dictionary, and here's what the dictionary says it means, and you're doing the opposite, as with social
Hmm.
justice, for
Yeah.
example, um, anyone who applies that rational meaning is just trying to impose power on you so you can ignore it.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess
And
critical
so
theory is
the,
another one of those. There's nothing critical about it. It's just it's the opposite of critical thinking. Yeah.
absolutely, yes, it is. It is the exact opposite of what it purports to
Mm.
be, and nearly all of these things are.
Mm.
And you could say even feminism is
Mm.
for itself because you're not really helping women on a practical level if you make them become uh, obsessed ideological harridans who repulse any male they encounter.
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, it's not in evolutionary terms and in social terms, it's not advantageous to them. But that's what you're imposing on them because you're distorting their thinking with an ideology.
Mm. Yeah, there's a very interesting spin on the whole thing with the. I was reading Deborah So's book, and she was saying how the body positivity movement is a form of. How did she describe it? It's like it's a certain group of women making their rivals unappealable to men, which then serves them because they can have more. They can have more,
Yeah.
more choice for themselves.
Well,
Yeah,
and I can see, the thing that I don't understand why the people like Ben and
mm.
Jerry's haven't cottoned on to that one, because they've
Yeah,
done
it's
the
true.
whole supporting Black Lives Matter thing. They should really be, Ben and Jerry should be really supporting the kind of, fat is a feminist issue
Yeah.
kind of
They should
line.
actually.
And because that's of immediate benefit to
Yeah,
them. Get more of these women eating ice cream alone, um,
yeah.
whilst crying,
Whilst telling
and
them
it's of
like
enormous
they should make
benefit
it
to your
like
company.
the Lynx adverts where the woman's like just the more she eats, and then the more men just like these super good looking guys just start hoarding around her.
Yeah, yeah.
That would be funny.
Well, that would be a Polynesian advert, though, wouldn't
Yeah,
it? Because in Polynesia, there's actually the opposite. Traditionally, there was the opposite idea
yeah,
of what's attractive, wasn't there? Because very fat women were associated with being wealthy
yeah. But I don't know how that
and
fits in
being
with the with
successful.
because I know that the waist to hip ratio where the hips are well the waist is 70% of the hips, which is 0.7.
Yeah,
That ratio is actually that ratio sorry is actually universal across the species, across the continents, and which again, I think this is one of the things that for me really brought me into this, which was like there are truths that I know about from my studies that were being very much trampled on by these very ideological concepts, and yeah, I would say that zero point 0.7 is you just have to build. Gad Sad really nails this point in his book. You have to build up this what I think he calls it a nomenological network of knowledge or something where you kind of when you're arguing with someone you actually say look, for example, zero point 0.7, this is a universal trait, so it can't be imposed by culture. It also matches very well with fertility. It's also it matches with youthfulness, and even blind men who have been born blind also have a tactile preference for this ratio, so then you've got this math.
and unlike sighted men, they have a legitimate excuse for testing it, don't they? In a tactile sense.
Yeah,
To an extent,
yeah, but I
anyway.
mean,
But
so you have to build up these very strong.
yeah, but how would the Polynesian
I
kind of
don't know.
example
I
fit
don't know
in with that
because I
then?
mean, one thing that I noticed from even when you take into account the new sort of trend towards big booties, for example, there is a
Yeah,
even then you still maintain those ratios. So I know that there is a notable difference between the preferences of from black culture and the preferences from white culture, where the word thick is used as a very complimentary term for women. But even then, you still see ratios. You still see sort
yeah.
of how would you say it, thicker women, but the ratios are still tied in with these evolutionary. So even when culture changes certain aspects, the sort of the biological aspect is still there. You know.
Well, the underlying statistics are the same, even though it looks
Yeah,
different.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but yeah. So, what do you want to
Yeah,
discuss
so I mean,
next?
I think we could round it up really. So
Yeah.
yeah, what do you think? Where do you think we're heading? Where do you think, is there anything that you would like to add, or is there any hope? I think that would be a good point to round it up on.
I'd say the hope that we have is in the fact that there is a growing resistance to all of these processes. Cultural Marxism is ascendant, but it's not unchallenged. And it's increasingly challenged, as you said earlier, by people who don't have a kind of institutional framework of support. So it's independent voices on social media, it's independent voices doing podcasts, it's individual researchers going against the consensus of opinion. Um, and that is linked to a whole groundswell of support amongst ordinary people who feel that these processes have gone too far and who actually are somewheres and do feel connected to individual countries and nations and do feel connected to Western civilization as a whole, and that it has done more good than bad. So there's certainly the potential for a fight back, and there are stirrings of a fight back, but we are at a very dangerous point where, for example, if a fraudulent US election is allowed to go ahead and
Be careful what you
triumph.
say, because I don't want the whole video to be cancelled.
Well, in that kind of
Yeah.
scenario, well, we're at a high watermark of the power of cultural Marxism at the moment, and the only place you go further along this line, if they keep winning, is into Soviet-style societies.
Right.
So it's incredibly urgent to fight back, and it's a moral imperative
And
now.
this is I remember on one of your chapters you said, I think you were addressing why you were doing this, and you said, we need to inspire the silent majority to get involved in the fight. And again, Gad Saad, this is one of his things that he's trying to really encourage people to do. And I think, if we, it's something that we all have to sort of move together on. But again, it's the cost. There is a cost, and in academia, in media, which are some of the industries which are most influenced by this stuff, there is a considerable cost, I would say.
Oh, absolutely. It's career ending for some people. And, you've just got to look at the hysterical reactions to Jordan Peterson, who's not right wing. He's not, he doesn't express himself anywhere near as virulently as I do, for example. And that, but the reactions to him are hysterical and insane. The fact that people at his publisher were crying and demanding that the publisher not publish his next, when that's an international bestseller, the first one.
Yeah,
The second one will be the
it
same.
pays for all of their
And
salaries, basically, his books.
it pays for all of their salaries and keeps that company going. And they want to cancel it.
Yeah.
Now, if you think of someone of that level of status, and again, the most right-wing thing that Jordan Peterson has ever said is clean your bedroom. He's not someone expressing very right-wing points.
But
He's
technically,
expressing
the refusal to use gender pronouns, that would be, I wouldn't say it's right wing, but it would be certainly branded as right wing, and
it's branded as such, but it's not. It's Jordan Peterson is actually embodying classical liberal values, because the classical liberal value would tell you don't actually have the right to impose
compelled speech versus
on
free
others.
speech.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Jordan Peterson is just online with classical liberalism there. And that's his perspective. He's a classical liberal.
And I suppose he does go in quite hard
himself.
to Marxism as well, which also again would technically make him right wing as well. But I mean, I'm a huge fan of what he does, and
that's yeah, but again, that's addressing a failure. And I think a lot of the scenario we're in now comes from the fact that people post World War II didn't respond with the same universal moral opprobrium towards communism that they did towards Nazism. And if we just acknowledge that, that the same methodology used for maybe opposite political intentions, but the same methodology was at work from communism as was at work from Nazism, and that anyone today casually supporting communism is casually supporting 100 million deaths that have taken place because of
does that
communism.
even include
If we
literal
acknowledge
communists as
that,
well, like Ash Sarkar?
yeah, absolutely. You stand there and you tell people I'm a literal communist. What you're saying is I literally endorse 100 million murders. That's what you're saying.
Yeah.
and we allow these people airtime, and we allow these people to frame the narrative for all of us, and yet at the same time we're pursuing microaggressions, which is somebody may have blinked in the wrong way.
Yeah. I agree with everything you just said, but I don't think it's a hopeful point. So so
Yeah, let's end on a
yeah,
hopeful
let's.
note. Yeah.
So you think?
Well, I suppose the hopeful thing I could say is that Ash Sarkar's reasonably attractive, if it wasn't for her mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
So
but I'm sure she.
you in your book, I would say that the I felt it's very much in two segments, and one of them, the first segment was looking into all of the benefits coming from the Greeks and then the Romans, and then up into the British Empire, and all of the positive things that we actually have in our in the heritage, in our heritage in the West, and then you kind of go into some of the more sort of ideas like feminism, which are sort of bringing down Western civilization. So yeah, maybe you can just give us maybe a summary of the key elements, the positives, logic, reason, and these things that we should be reconnecting with in the West, right now.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Because what we're fighting for is, we'll be told that we're fighting for fascism, and we're fighting against that because fascism was an aberration. Nazism was an aberration in the history of the West. What we are fighting for is logic, reason, democracy, genuine equality, whereby people aren't judged by their skin color, no matter who they are. We're fighting for all the positives that have been slowly acquired over millennia by Western civilization, and that have taken over 2,000 years to reach this point where most of us are comfortable, most of us aren't in danger of starving, most of us have the right to, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as the Americans put it. These things were acquired over centuries, and they took a very long time for us to get to this point where we have them. And unfortunately, it's a lot quicker to remove those things than it is to gain them. So that's why the fight is vital, and that's why we're engaged in it, because we need to defend these things for everyone.
Great. Okay, I think that was a really nice finale. So just to end, I would say that Daniel's book is fantastic. Thanks for having me. Thanks for coming on my podcast today. His book is fantastic. You can find it in the link in the comments. So it's A Gift for Treason by Daniel Jupp. And thanks again for coming. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks for having me, Johan.